Hi, welcome to another episode of the PIM Academy. Today we have a special guest. Joining us in the studio is Marcin Żebrowski, Senior Symfony Developer from Macopedia, who will answer a few technical questions for us today.
Hi, thanks for having me.
Marcin, we already have a dozen or so PIM system implementations under our belt, from various industries for different clients. We've also recorded a few episodes that introduce us to the topic of PIM. At the same time, we notice that more and more questions are coming up regarding the technical aspects of PIM system implementations. Often, clients don't really know what all of this entails.
Yes, that's right. And these are diverse questions, for example about integration, hosting, or PIM systems. So in this episode, we'll try to answer questions from clients.
So, let us begin with a brief warm-up question. Clients frequently inquire, okay, we are going to implement a product information management, PIM, system, and we will certainly optimize the entire process of adding comprehensive product information. But how exactly is this truly going to significantly speed up our daily work with all of our products? How is it supposed to make adding products to e-commerce faster?
That's a very good question to start with. The time optimization mainly comes from having all the product information gathered in one place. In companies, it's that data is collected in different Excel files, various departments, and individual departments don't know that the information they need is Excel file department. By gathering data in the PIM, we have everything in one place, easy access, and create integrations with other systems. We can integrate with ERP, Ecommerce, Marketplace, photo editing systems, or DM. These integrations, middleware, information flows smoothly into those systems.
Exactly. And here comes the question and the key word. What exactly is this famous middleware?
Middleware is like a command center in IT systems. As the name suggests, it's software that sits in the middle of something. And here, we have an application that sits between our PIM, our e-commerce, and other systems. And assuming we have an ERP, the middleware's communication might look like this. We have an ERP, to which a user adds some new information. Then the middleware takes that information from the ERP, modifies it, and sends it to the PIM. At that point, the information is now in the PIM. On the other side of the middleware, for example, there might be an e-commerce platform, and then the middleware will take the data from our PIM, transform it, and upload it to the e-commerce system. That's why we say it sits in the middle, between the ERP and, for example, the e-commerce.
But as I understand it, sometimes building middleware isn't necessary?
Yes, sometimes we have the option to build integrations without using middleware. In that case, we can create a direct connection between the PIM and the individual systems. However, for this to work, we need a PIM that gives us this capability, because it's not possible with every system. First and foremost, it has to be an open source platform, meaning one that gives us access to the underlying code. Alternatively, a platform that allows us to add some custom elements, and then we can implement something like that. Compared to the middleware version, there's less development work here. But this solution mainly has drawbacks, because we become heavily tied to the code in that platform. And this can be a problem. For example, if we want to update the platform to a newer version, since then we'll have the issue of needing to test everything all over again. Some things will stop working and we'll have to implement certain features ourselves. And this will make it impossible to switch from one platform to another. Because, as I mentioned, we're very tightly bound to the platform we initially chose. That's why middleware is a good solution. We don't always create middleware that's a fully custom solution of our own. With every project, we always try to analyze whether we can use some kind of low-code platform. Recently, we had an implementation where we used the low-code platform Mage.ai. What is a low-code platform? Maybe I'll explain that first. It's a platform where you don't have to code everything yourself. Instead, you get a set of functionalities from the provider that you can use to build an integration. And we only add individual pieces of code there. So for example, all the information about workflows, all the error logging, that's already included in the package. And we just implement the small functionalities ourselves, like changing one attribute to another. And that's the case if we're using a platform that has an open source version. In the case of the SaaS version, meaning an application with closed source code that is hosted by the solution provider, we can't use such an approach without middleware. In that case, we have to use middleware, or we can use one of the existing plugins available for these platforms. There's also the option to build our own plugin, but usually that's not very cost-effective. It takes a lot of time, so we generally try to adjust the requirements so that we can use one of the plugins offered in the solutions marketplace.
Okay, so to sum up, if we want to integrate a product information management (PIM) system, we essentially have three distinct options to carefully choose from. The first primary option, if we possess a PIM with open source code that we can readily access and freely modify, is that we can then proceed to build a direct and seamless integration. We can also alternatively build a robust middleware solution, which will typically communicate via a well-defined API with the PIM system and with the various systems to which the valuable data is being transferred. We also frequently utilize this middleware approach when we have a PIM with closed source code, that is, in those specific licensed SaaS versions. The third option is also to consider using ready-made plugins that are readily available on the market. If you could tell us a bit more about those specific plugins themselves then, that would be very helpful.
Absolutely.
How are plugins different from direct integrations? Or, can we also effectively utilize plugins when we are implementing middleware solutions? And how does that work?
So plugins are ready-made small applications that we add to our larger application. The advantage is that we don't need to build the integration from scratch. We just install a ready-made solution and all we have to do is configure it. That's the biggest advantage. The biggest drawback of this solution is that we can't modify this kind of plugin to fit our needs. Instead, we have to adapt to what the plugin offers. And sometimes that's a problem. Often it is a problem, but in many cases, for example, the client sees that such a plugin offers a lot of possibilities, and the changes needed in their organization are minor, changes that would allow them to use the plugin and thus save a lot of time. So to sum up, a plugin is a good solution if we want to quickly set up some integration. If we can adapt a bit to this integration, maybe make some compromises here and there. But if we have more advanced needs, then we usually have to go for custom solutions.
Tell me, when thoughtfully designing a comprehensive system architecture, do you generally recommend introducing a diverse mix of different and varied solutions? If we have readily available plugins, and if it's indeed possible to build direct and seamless integrations, what approach would be most beneficial? How does it look in practice?
In practice, the best solution is to find a ready-made option and just implement it. If we don't have to write our own code, then that's definitely the best, cheapest, and fastest option. Only if we don't have such a solution available, that's when we try to write something ourselves. So yes, it's best to do a mix, with a preference for using ready-made solutions.
Okay, staying on the topic of integrations. Let's assume for a moment that we already have an integration built, whether that's using some middleware, by creating a direct integration, or perhaps by using some kind of plugin. Now, the crucial aspect of data synchronization and the frequency of that synchronization truly comes into play. Do we have to trigger this data update manually? Or does it happen automatically?
Most of the time, it happens automatically, because we aim for the systems to operate on their own, without our intervention. And here, we usually determine how often they need to update. We can set it to update once a day, but if we need it to update more frequently, we can, for example, set the update to happen every 15 minutes. However, it's important to remember that such data transfers can impact our system, so if we do it too often, we might experience some downtime in our applications. There's a hybrid solution where we use an automatic process. So, every day at midnight, when people aren't working, the systems automate. But we provide the option to trigger the integration manually. If someone needs to add something to the system and have it appear in another system, they can trigger it manually.
That really is an important aspect, as you mentioned. Often, our clients appreciate the automation of integration, that is, the fact that it happens at night, once a day, and that's exactly what they want. However, they also very often ask whether there will be an option to trigger the integration manually. There are often processes that require updating some data on the website or in e-commerce literally right at that moment. So, I think adding such an option to the integration is important. Actually, as far as I remember, in almost every one of our projects we added such a possibility. Moving on to the next question related to integrations, a common question is, what is the cost of building an integration and how long does it take? Are there any ways to reduce that cost? Do we have any tricks?
First, the cost of integration depends on the complexity of the integration. We had an integration with a data bank where we copied about 300 attributes, and even if we calculated 30 minutes to prepare one attribute, this comes out to 19 working days. So here we're dealing with a large integration that involves a lot of work, and that's primarily what affects the cost. Another aspect is how many such integrations we have to do as part of a given implementation. And there's also the question of whether the system we're integrating with has been around for a long time or is only now being created. We recently had a situation where we were integrating with a system that was just being implemented by the client. And it turned out during the implementation phase that a lot of things simply didn't work. There was no documentation for it, so that extended our implementation timeline. So these kinds of things also need to be taken into account during the pre-implementation analysis. And when it comes to ways to shorten this time, well, as Macopedia, we've already implemented a lot of systems, so we already have some things done. For example, if we're creating our middleware, we don't have to write that middleware from scratch every time. For instance, we don't have to create the functionality that fetches data from the channel every time, because we've already written it, and just move it between projects. The systems we integrate with, if popular and widely used, usually have software packages created for them, which we can download and use in our own systems. Wherever possible, we obviously use plugins, which we mentioned earlier, because that also shortens our workload. And during the pre-implementation analysis stage, it often happens that when we talk to the client about the system, it turns out that not everything they've planned will actually be needed right from the start, so we can prioritize the implementations. So, for example, at the beginning we only do the key integrations. Once the system starts running, it starts to prove itself. Only then do we implement the next things that will be needed.
Listen, we've already recorded 2 comprehensive episodes about the significant cost of implementing a PIM solution, and also about the crucial pre-implementation analysis and its paramount importance in the entire PIM implementation process. So, we strongly encourage you to catch up on those valuable episodes and become thoroughly familiar with their content, in order to truly clarify and deeply enhance your knowledge about these implementation costs. Now, Marcin, you specifically mentioned mainly the cost of integration here, because that's the primary topic we are thoroughly discussing today, particularly related to the programming work and the significant effort we truly need to put into this integration process. But if you also want to hear about the full and comprehensive cost of implementing PIM, we cordially invite you to check out the previous episode. Marcin, as we have thoroughly discussed today, a meticulously prepared and thoughtfully considered implementation, along with properly chosen integration methods and carefully planned processes, truly allows us to implement in a highly optimized way and significantly helps to reduce overall costs. But the question arises, how do we prepare this data for implementation and for future integrations? If you could also please give our clients some advice, what exactly should they do? What specific steps should they take to properly prepare for the entire process of integrating PIM with their other systems?
Certainly, the very first and most important thing is to conduct an audit of the attributes and product information that we currently have. As has already been mentioned here, everything is usually scattered across different systems. It might be in Excel, it might be in the ERP, or, for example, photos might be stored in a DAM system. You need to gather all of this in one place and really see what you have. The next step is to really consider which data needs to go where, because it doesn't make sense for us to import all, say, 300 attributes we have from the PIM into a system that will only use 5 of them. First of all, we'd have to manage data we don't need, and secondly, it's still an integration cost that we don't want to incur. And another important thing is data mapping. Once we have the data ready to be uploaded to the PIM, we first need to map it so that we can actually import it into the PIM. In other words, we need to prepare it so that it's organized within the PIM. Similarly, if we want to transfer data between the PIM and another system, we also need to set up some kind of mapping here. So, for example, in the PIM we have such rich data. We can have numerical data, metric data, a photo. But if we want to transfer this to another system where, for example, there are only photos and text, then we must convert our data into text. So that's also something we need to work on before the actual implementation.
Okay, from our perspective as a dedicated implementation partner, we also very often work with our valued clients using a comprehensive and dedicated file, where we simply define the full and complete list of all relevant attributes at the very beginning, and then we precisely specify which particular attributes should be exchanged with which specific systems, and if it is absolutely necessary, we carefully identify exactly how to transform that particular data. So, as I understand it, from your technical perspective, this particular data transformation, that is to say, the mapping and precisely how the data looks in the PIM versus how it should ultimately look in the target system, is probably especially important.
Yes, foundation middleware operates.
Okay, moving on to the next area. You mentioned the DAM system several times today, that is, a system for storing photos, videos, and multimedia files. And indeed, sometimes companies already use this kind of software and have a DAM system in place, but very often there are still shared drives or FTP servers where photos are uploaded. So, how do you deal with storing photos in this way? How do you then import such photos into the PIM? Can a PIM even serve as a DAM system?
First and foremost, we need to consider what we want to use this functionality for. If it's just about storing multimedia, then PIMs should be sufficient for us here. Different PIMs, like Akineo, Ergonode, PIMcore, the ones we offer, have various capabilities. But if it's just about storage and maybe some minor edits or sharing, then the PIM version should be more than enough for us. If we expect something more, like the ability to scale images, generate thumbnails, or generally do things with our multimedia, then we need to consider choosing a specific DAM system, what capabilities it has, and what it can offer us. That's when we can actually create an integration.
So, as I understand it, in general, we can effectively store various photos or diverse multimedia files within the PIM system, equipped with essential and fundamental functionalities when it comes to comprehensively managing these digital images and media assets. But please tell me, what exactly does that mean? Do we actually always physically store these images in the PIM? Or does it maybe depend on the scale and number of these images?
Here we have a few options, because first of all, if we, for example, purchase Akineo in the SaaS version, we get storage space, and it works in such a way our images are stored on storage, and information about them is displayed directly in Akineo. We also have the option to, for example, buy additional cloud storage if we find that the capacity is too small and we need more. We can also have our own server and connect that server to this solution. So, there are actually quite a few possibilities here, depending probably on where it turns out to be cheapest to store these images.
When it comes to further essential work with these digital images, so we've already meticulously collected the photographic assets in the PIM system, or quite possibly in a secure cloud storage that is directly connected to the PIM, and we subsequently want to publish these valuable images on a dedicated website or within an e-commerce online store. How exactly does the crucial transfer of these multimedia files actually function in this particular case?
So, systems often have the ability to share photos directly to these sites, but that's not a good solution. I'm mentioning this because clients often ask whether we'll be able to host photos directly from Akineo, Ergonode, or another PIM. This isn't a good solution mainly because PIMs aren't designed for high-speed traffic. Here, we usually recommend that PIMs serve as the master data source for the image, so that the main, high-quality photo is stored there, while we provide the images through a CDN. This is the system that fetches the image, can, for example, resize it on the fly, and then make it available in a specific marketplace, for instance. And then it works much faster, because these are systems designed to handle such heavy traffic.
So, it all truly comes down to precisely what the client actually and genuinely needs. If, as I comprehensively understand it, their specific and particular needs regarding extensive multimedia files and high-resolution photos are indeed very high, and they genuinely want to perform some more advanced and complex data transformations, then it is certainly worth carefully considering implementing a robust digital asset management (DAM) system. However, if what we truly care about most is simply storing these essential files and then possibly later delivering them to various distribution channels, such as e-commerce platforms or a dedicated website, then a PIM will certainly do the job effectively.
Yes, and it depends on how often you need to access them, so you might want to use a CDN.
All right, Marcin, the next question in our series of technical questions is about data formats. How do we handle different data formats? We know that sometimes within an organization we use various types of files. Here we have a CSV file, over there we have an Excel file, and then we have some multimedia files that we need to pass along. How do we deal with these data formats when it comes to transferring data from the PIM to other systems?
The key issue here is, above all, translating everything into a common language so that the systems can communicate with each other. If, for example, we have something in an Excel file, PIMs offer us the ability to upload that Excel file and then the translation of that data happens behind the scenes within what the given PIM provides. In many solutions, we have configurators that allow us to map columns from Excel to specific attributes. And then it's the PIM that takes care of translating that data. However, if we're pulling this data from other systems, then we use APIs and have to do the mapping on our side. And here, we create various types of transformers that take data from one system, convert it, for example, into the format used in the PIM, and then save it in the PIM. Then, if we want to send it to another system, we have to translate it again in some way. And now, for example, we can export the data to Excel. And here, we often have features that let us generate an Excel file in a format that will fit the other system we want to upload it to. Or again, using something like Middleware, we translate the data from Canoe into a format that fits another system. And then we send it via API and save it in that system.
I think the important topic of file formats is also very closely tied to the crucial issue of migrating all the relevant data at the very start into the PIM system. Break time equals 0.5s/. How do you actually see the significant aspect of importing all this diverse data here, especially when a company often has all this valuable information spread across a dozen or so different and disparate Excel files, and we have to somehow effectively merge all these various files, or at least the essential data from them, and then accurately import the complete product data into the PIM system?
This is also one way to save time, because one of the possible approaches could be to connect automatically to all these systems, transform the data, and then save it to the PIM. The only thing is, such a solution takes a lot of time, because we have to connect to all of these systems. We also don't really know exactly what's in these systems or how to use them, so that's where the audit I mentioned comes in, and clients do carry out this audit. And since they conduct this audit, they take responsibility for it and gather everything in Excel files, which we can then upload to PIM, sometimes with minor adjustments, or even without any changes at all.
And do we typically use any specific scripts or semi-automations for this particular purpose, which allow us to, so to speak, effectively pull this valuable data from the various files directly into PIM?
Yes, we use scripts, mainly because we're dealing with a large number of attributes and a lot of products, and we simply can't check everything manually. We have one method like that, kind of a brute force approach, meaning we try to force it through. So we give clients a template, they fill it in with attributes from their Excels, and then we just try to import it into the given PIM. There, we usually get error messages, and based on those error messages, we create scripts that go through the individual Excels and fix the errors we have there. Alternatively, they generate some better reports there. Regarding those errors, we then go back to the client. Together, we determine how we should fix it, and then we can use a script to correct the entire Excel again. And after a few attempts, we usually manage to import such data. We could also try connecting directly to the client's systems and retrieving the data that way, but the Excel method turns out to be more optimal, since it's a part of the work the client can handle themselves, which helps save costs because we don't have to create integrations with those systems. It also takes much less time, and we can fill the PIM with data more quickly, even before we start working on further integrations that are needed as part of the implementation.
Great. Thanks, Marcin, for that explanation. Another area that often comes up for our clients is the topic of hosting the PIM system itself. Where will it be installed? Do I need to provide a server for this PIM? Or will you as the provider or the implementation partners supply it? How does it work? And this question often comes up for us as well, so if you could tell us a bit about installing the PIM itself. How does that process look?
First of all, it depends on which PIM we're going to implement, because depending on the PIM, we have different options. We divide PIMs in terms of servers into two categories. The first are the free community platforms. They are open source, and providers of these solutions do not guarantee servers. In that case, as a company, we either provide the client with a server where it will be installed, or the client provides a server if they have, and we handle the installation. On the other hand, if we're dealing with SaaS, closed, out-of-the-box solutions, then installation is handled by the company that provides the PIM. In that case, we don't have access to either the code or the server. We simply get a ready-made platform that we can interact with.
Looking more closely at the various platforms themselves, or more precisely, the PIM systems themselves, as you thoughtfully mentioned, Marcin, the commercially licensed SaaS systems that are currently available are Akeneo Enterprise and Ergonode, while the open source systems, those with completely open code and entirely free to use, are Akeneo Community and PIM Core Community. So here, when carefully considering a specific system and also where it will be installed, it's worth keeping in mind that usually these community versions are installed on, let's say, your own servers. Break time equals 0.5s/. On the other hand, with SaaS, specifically licensed versions, the software is comprehensively provided by the service provider, so in that particular case, we absolutely don't have to worry about the server infrastructure. Break time equals 0.5s/Marcin. So here's the very last question from our little Q&A session today. This particular question really touches on the technical aspect and the intricate development work. Namely, clients often come to us with a specific request to add a new feature that isn't readily available in the existing PIM system. So it's a very specific requirement or a particular function they expected the system to absolutely have, but it currently doesn't, and it relates strictly and directly to a core business process within their company. And adding such a crucial function has a clear business justification, so we often get asked whether we can simply customize this essential functionality in the PIM, perhaps add a new module or something similar to that. Could you please tell us how this looks from your valuable perspective? What can we develop in the PIM? And how can we do it?
First of all, we check the App Store for the given PIM, right? Is there something that meets our needs? Because, as I mentioned earlier, it's cheaper to use a ready-made solution than to build a new one. And if there isn't, then we do have some options to create something like that ourselves. And now, we basically split this into two systems. First of all, if it's an open system, open source, meaning one of those free ones where we have access to the code, then really the only thing that limits us is our budget, because we can do almost anything there. We can add our own functionalities, change things on the front end. But you have to remember that these solutions are usually expensive and problematic, because if we ever encounter an update to the system, the plugin we create might stop working. Still, we are able to do it this way, by hooking into the given solution. A better solution is to create the functionality alongside it. So, for example, if we have middleware, we consider whether to move this functionality there. We base it on what the given PIM offers us, and build on that foundation. So, for instance, if some data needs to be modified, we pull that data from the PIM, modify it in the middleware, and then save it again. You also need to pay attention to whether a given solution offers us a way to add functionality. Because, for example, if we're using Akeneo, we can add an app to the App Store, but that's expensive. If we're using Ergonode, there we also have the option to create a custom application. However, it works similarly to middleware, only it's integrated directly into the application itself. On the other hand, PIM Core is the most geared towards making such modifications. So yes, we truly have the ability to make modifications, but we need to carefully consider above all whether we're genuinely getting the right and appropriate value for it, and precisely how much time it will realistically take to fully do it.
We also often look for a suitable solution within the system itself. Sometimes, clients expect that this exact functionality will simply appear within the system, but when we start asking pertinent questions, digging a bit deeper, and clarifying what the real underlying need is behind adding this particular functionality, it often turns out that perhaps the PIM features we already have are indeed quite sufficient for their needs. So I think that's always something to analyze as well. Is a certain specific functionality that our valued clients were previously accustomed to and used to really necessary to add and implement?
Yes, we move from one version of the system to a higher version, because that's where the needed functionality is. And it's also more cost-effective to switch to that version.
All right, everyone, that was our very last question from today's insightful Q&A series. If you have any more pressing questions, whether they're about specific technical aspects or about PIM systems in general, please feel free to leave them in the comments below. We'll be absolutely happy to answer them for you. That's all for today. Marcin, thank you so very much for joining us in today's insightful Q&A session and for thoroughly explaining all those complex technological intricacies related to PIMs and their integrations. It's great that you were able to join us today.
Thanks for the invitation, Carolina. I'm glad I could help, and I hope our conversation will turn out to be useful.
Thank you for being with us today. See you in the next episode of the PIM Academy.